Welcome to our deep dive today.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to unpack something that might sound a bit dry at first glance. The Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974.
Yeah.
But before you think,
Yeah.
oh, this is just about,
Hard hats.
yeah, hard hats and warning signs and things, let me assure you, this act reaches far beyond construction sites. We're talking about a law
Right.
that has quietly shaped the way we work and live
For sure, for sure.
for over 50 years, impacting everything from the design of your office chair to the safety measures on your daily commute.
It really is. I think what's fascinating about this act is how it's woven into the fabric of our lives, often in ways we don't even realize.
Absolutely.
And today we'll be exploring not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit behind it, using excerpts directly from the 1974 Act itself, and some really intriguing supporting documents that hint at how it's been amended and updated over the years.
All right, because we're not just going to list out rules here. We're going to uncover the thinking behind those rules, how they've evolved, and what they might mean for the future of work. So buckle up, get ready for some surprising insights. And by the end of this, you'll never look at a warning label the same way again.
I love that. Yeah, let's set the stage. Back in 1974, the UK was experiencing a wave of industrial accidents.
Wow.
And there was this growing recognition that something needed to be done to protect workers.
Yeah.
This act was a landmark piece of legislation, a fundamental shift in how we think about responsibility for health and safety,
Okay.
moving away from simply reacting to accidents to proactively preventing them.
I see. So it's not just about telling employers to be careful. It's about establishing a clear legal framework, outlining specific duties and responsibilities for everyone involved.
Exactly. And the Act spells out the core purpose right at the beginning, securing the health, safety, and welfare of persons at work, and crucially, protecting persons other than persons at work from work-related risks.
Oh, so that second part is often overlooked, I imagine.
It is, but it's key because it recognizes that the impact of work extends beyond the factory floor or the construction site.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. The Act lays out a whole bunch of responsibilities for employers. But before we dive into those, I'm curious about this concept of reasonably practicable steps. It comes up a lot, and it seems to suggest that absolute safety isn't always the goal.
You've hit on a crucial point. The Act acknowledges that achieving zero risk in every workplace scenario is often impossible or disproportionately expensive.
Right.
So instead of aiming for the unattainable, it focuses on taking reasonably practicable steps to ensure safety. This means balancing the level of risk with the cost and effort required to control it.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance between protecting people and allowing work to continue. But doesn't that leave a lot of room for interpretation? How do you determine what's reasonably practicable in a given situation?
That is where things get really interesting. The Act doesn't give a hard and fast definition. Instead, it relies on a process of risk assessment, where employers are expected to identify potential hazards, evaluate the likelihood and severity of those hazards, and then take appropriate steps to control the risks.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty involved process.
Yeah.
Is this where those approved codes of practice come in? We'll definitely get into those in more detail later. But just for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick overview of what they are and how they relate to this idea of reasonably practicable steps?
Absolutely. Think of the approved codes of practice as practical guides to help employers and others comply with the Act's requirements. They provide specific advice on how to manage various risks, drawing on best practices and industry standards. While they're not legally binding, they offer a benchmark for what's considered reasonable behavior.
So if an employer follows the relevant codes of practice, they're more likely to be seen as having taken reasonably practicable steps.
Exactly. And in a legal dispute, those codes can be used as evidence to show that an employer either did or did not meet their obligations.
Okay, got it. So let's get back to those employer responsibilities. The Act seems to take a pretty comprehensive approach, covering everything from the physical environment to the way work is organized.
It does, and one of the key duties is to provide and maintain safe systems of work. This isn't just about making sure the building isn't going to collapse. It's about designing work processes and procedures in a way that minimizes risks to health and safety.
So we're talking about things like clear lines of communication, proper training, well-defined emergency procedures.
Precisely. And it extends to the tools and equipment employees use. Employers have a responsibility to ensure that equipment is safe, properly maintained, and used correctly. This includes providing appropriate safety gear and making sure employees are trained on how to use it.
And it's not just about physical safety. The Act also addresses things like handling hazardous substances safely and providing necessary training for employees who work with those substances.
Right. And another interesting aspect is the requirement for a written safety policy. It's not enough for an employer to simply say they care about safety. They
Yeah.
need to put it down in writing, outlining their commitment to health and safety, and the steps they'll take to ensure a safe working environment.
Yeah, it's about making that commitment visible and holding themselves accountable.
Exactly. And to make sure those policies aren't just empty words, the Act encourages the establishment of safety committees. These committees, comprised of both employer and employee representatives, are tasked with monitoring safety measures, identifying potential hazards, and making recommendations for improvements.
That's a smart way to ensure that safety isn't just a top-down initiative. It involves employees in the process, giving them a voice in shaping their own working environment.
And that collaborative approach is key. It's about fostering a culture of safety, where everyone feels responsible for identifying and mitigating risks.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but we've mainly focused on the employer side of things. What about the employees themselves? Do they have any responsibilities under the Act?
Absolutely. While the Act places a significant emphasis on the employer's role, it recognizes that safety is a two-way street.
Okay, I'm ready to hear the employee side of the story. What does the Act expect of them?
Well, first and foremost, employees have a duty to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, and that of others who might be affected by their actions.
Okay.
This means following safety procedures, using equipment properly, and reporting any hazards they encounter.
So it's about being proactive and taking ownership of their own safety.
Exactly. But it goes beyond that. Employees also have a duty to cooperate with their employer's safety efforts. If they're provided with training or safety equipment, they're expected to participate and use those resources responsibly.
It's about working together, understanding that everyone has a part to play in creating a safe working environment. But what happens when things go wrong? Who makes sure everyone is playing by the rules?
That's where the enforcement piece comes in. And this is where we start to see the Act's teeth.
Oh, I like where this is going. Tell me more about this enforcement side of things.
Well, the Act establishes the Health and Safety Executive, or HSE, as the main body responsible for enforcing its provisions. And these guys have some serious authority.
Right, spill it. What can the HSE actually do if someone isn't complying with the Act?
The HSE has a range of powers, including the ability to appoint inspectors who can enter workplaces, examine machinery and substances, take measurements, and even seize dangerous articles. They can require people to provide information or answer questions, and they can take samples for analysis.
So they don't just show up and politely ask if everything's all right.
Yeah,
They can really dig in and make sure things are up to snuff.
absolutely. And if an inspector finds a serious risk, they can issue an improvement notice, which requires the employer to take specific actions to remedy the situation within a set time frame.
Okay, but what if the situation is really dangerous, like an
Yeah.
imminent risk of injury? Does the HSE have the power to shut things down on the spot?
Yes, in those cases. And inspectors can issue a prohibition notice. This notice prohibits the continuation of the activity or the use of the equipment that poses the risk, effectively shutting things down until the issue is addressed.
Wow, they really do have some teeth. But I'm guessing there are also situations where it's not so black and white, where there might be a breach of the Act, but it's not necessarily an immediate danger. What happens in those cases?
Well, there's a range of enforcement options available to the HSE. They can issue warnings, provide advice and guidance, or even prosecute an employer if they believe a serious breach has occurred.
So it's not just about punishment. It's about working with employers to improve safety and prevent future incidents. And speaking of working together, we touched on those approved codes of practice earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about how those fit into the enforcement picture?
Sure. While the approved codes of practice aren't legally binding in the sense that you won't be automatically prosecuted for failing to follow them, they do play a significant role in enforcement. If you're taken to court for a breach of the Act, failure to observe the relevant code of practice can be used as evidence against you.
So it's like a benchmark for what's considered reasonable behavior. If an employer has deviated from the code, it's going to be harder for them to argue that they've taken all reasonably practicable steps.
Exactly. The codes provide a strong indication of what's expected in terms of good practice. So while you're not legally obligated to follow them to the letter, it's certainly wise to pay close attention to their recommendations. They can be valuable resources for employers who want to ensure they're meeting their obligations under the Act.
And I bet they're helpful for employees as well, giving them a clear understanding of what they can expect from their employer in terms of safety measures.
You're absolutely right. They can empower employees to advocate for their own safety. and hold their employers accountable.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the employer's responsibilities to the employee's duties, the enforcement mechanisms, those approved codes of practice. It's a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more to explore in this act, especially when you consider how it's been amended and updated over the years.
Well, before we get into those amendments, I think it's worth pausing here for a quick recap, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We started by talking about the Act's core purpose, securing the health, safety, and welfare of persons at work. And remember, that includes people who might not even be considered traditional employees.
Right. It's about recognizing that the impact of work extends beyond the workplace itself.
Right. We then delved into the idea of reasonably practicable steps, highlighting how the Act balances safety with practicality. We talked about the importance of risk assessment and how the approved codes of practice provide guidance on meeting those standards. And we unpacked the employer's responsibilities, from providing safe systems of work to ensuring the safe handling of hazardous substances. We also touched on the requirement for a written safety policy and the role of safety committees in fostering a collaborative approach to safety.
We also explored the employee's side of the equation, highlighting their duty to take reasonable care for their own safety and the safety of others, and to cooperate with their employer's safety efforts.
Then we got into the enforcement side of things, discussing the powers of the health and safety executive, those all-important inspectors, and the different types of notices they can issue to address safety concerns.
And we circled back to the approved codes of practice, emphasizing their role as benchmarks for good practice and their potential impact in legal proceedings.
All right, so that's the foundation. Now let's step back in time for a moment. This act was passed back in 1974. That's over 50 years ago.
It's amazing.
A lot has changed since then, both in terms of the types of work we do and the technologies we use. Exactly. So how has this act managed to stay relevant in a world that looks vastly different from what it did back then? That's the question we're going to tackle in our next segment. We'll be diving into the fascinating evolution of this act and how it's been adapted to meet the changing demands of the modern workplace.
Stay tuned, because the journey gets even more intriguing as we explore how a law passed decades ago is still shaping the way we work and live today.
See you next time.
See you then. So you know what's remarkable about the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act?
What's that?
It's not just a set of rules frozen in time. The Act actually anticipates change. It has this built-in flexibility to adapt to new technologies, new industries, even new ways of working.
So they knew back in 1974 that things wouldn't stay the same. That's pretty forward-thinking.
It is. It speaks to the Act's enduring relevance. Let's take a look at our supporting documents here. We can actually see how the Act has been modified over time to address these emerging challenges. For example, we have some information here about the introduction of the Railway Safety Levy.
Okay, a railway safety levy. Tell me more about that. What is it, and why was it necessary?
Well, as you can imagine, the railway industry is incredibly complex. It involves this vast network of tracks and trains and signals and people, and the potential consequences of an accident are enormous.
Right, we're talking about a lot of moving parts.
Exactly. So the Railway Safety Levy was introduced to ensure that there's dedicated funding for safety initiatives. Companies that provide railway services are required to contribute to this levy, which is then used to support research inspections and other measures aimed at preventing accidents.
So it's not just about setting rules, it's about providing the resources to make those rules effective. That's smart.
It is, and it highlights how the Act can be tailored to address specific industry challenges. Another fascinating example of the Act's evolution is the addition of provisions related to nuclear safety.
Okay, now we're talking about a whole different level of risk. What kind of provisions are we talking about here?
Well, given the unique hazards associated with nuclear facilities, it's not surprising that specialized regulations are needed. The Act has been amended to empower a specific authority, the Office for Nuclear Regulation, to enforce safety standards in this sector. This authority has the expertise to assess risks, conduct inspections, and ensure that nuclear facilities are operated safely.
That makes sense. You need people who really understand the intricacies of nuclear technology to oversee safety in that field.
Precisely. And these amendments demonstrate how the Act can be adapted to address emerging technologies and industries that might not have even existed back in 1974. It's not just about factories and construction sites anymore. It's about keeping up with the changing face of work itself.
Yeah, I'm starting to see a pattern here. This act has a remarkable ability to keep pace with change. It's like it has a built-in growth mechanism.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us to a crucial question. How is the Act handling the even bigger shifts that we're seeing in the nature of work today? Think about the rise of the gig economy, remote work, artificial intelligence. These were barely on the horizon back in 1974.
Right. If I'm working from home, is my employer still responsible for my health and safety? What if I'm a freelancer juggling multiple clients? Where do I fit in?
These are exactly the sorts of questions that legal scholars and policymakers are grappling with right now. The Act, as it stands, primarily focuses on traditional employer-employee relationships and physical workplaces,
Right.
but the lines are blurring. And this raises some really complex questions about responsibility and liability in these new working models.
So is the act becoming obsolete? Is it struggling to keep up with these changes?
Not necessarily, but it certainly needs to be re-examined
Hmm?
and potentially updated to reflect these new realities. For example, there's a growing debate about whether the definition of employee should be broadened to include gig workers. This would provide them with greater protections under the Act.
That would be a major shift. It would mean that platforms like ride-hailing apps and delivery services would have to take more responsibility for the safety of their workers.
Exactly, and it's just one example of the many challenges facing the Act. As the world of work continues to evolve, there are also questions about how to manage the risks associated with artificial intelligence and automation. How do you ensure a safe remote working environment? And how do you address the mental health implications of these new working models?
It sounds like we're heading into uncharted territory, like the old map doesn't quite cover the new landscape.
In many ways we are, but here's the thing. The core principles of the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act remain as relevant as ever. The focus on shared responsibility, the emphasis on risk assessment and mitigation, the commitment to continuous improvement. These are timeless principles that can guide us as we navigate the complexities of the modern workplace.
You're right. It's about adapting those principles to new contexts, like having a solid foundation, but needing to build a new structure on top of it.
And that brings us to the most important question for you, our listener. What does all of this mean for you? How does this act, even though it was passed decades ago, impact your life today?
And even more importantly, how do you think this act should evolve to meet the challenges of the future of work? We've seen how it's been amended to keep up with changing technologies and industries.
But the pace of change is only accelerating.
We're seeing entirely new ways of working emerge.
And that raises a whole host of questions about responsibility, liability, and how to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of workers in this rapidly changing landscape.
Hold on to those thoughts, because in our final segment, we're going to pull back the curtain even further and explore those very questions. We'll examine the potential implications of the act for you and your future.
Join us as we continue this deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. We've traced its journey from its roots in the industrial era to its ongoing adaptation in the face of modern workplace challenges. But now it feels like we're stepping into the realm of speculation a little bit. What does the future hold for this landmark legislation?
Well, as we've discussed, the world of work is transforming at an unprecedented pace, and the Act is facing this whole new set of questions.
Yeah, we're talking about a seismic shift in how, where, and even who does the work. The traditional boundaries are blurring, and the Act needs to adapt to keep up.
Precisely. The rise of the gig economy, remote work, artificial intelligence, these are game changers, and they demand a fresh look at how we ensure worker safety and well-being in this evolving landscape.
So let's get specific. What are some of the key areas where we might see the Act being updated or reinterpreted in the near future?
Well, I think one major area is the definition of employee. The Act in its current form primarily focuses on these traditional employer-employee relationships, but the gig economy is challenging that model. We have millions of workers who are classified as independent contractors, often lacking the same protections as traditional employees.
So we might see a push to broaden that definition of employee to include gig workers, extending the Act's safety net to cover this growing segment of the workforce.
Exactly. That would have significant implications for platforms like ride-hailing apps and delivery services, placing greater responsibility on them to ensure the safety of their workers.
Another area that seems ripe for change is remote work. It's exploded in recent years, but the Act doesn't fully address the unique challenges of ensuring safety in a home office environment.
Right. If I'm working from home, who's responsible for making sure my workspace is ergonomically sound? What about the mental health implications of working in isolation? These are questions that demand attention.
So we might see updates to the Act that clarify the responsibilities of both employers and employees in a remote work context, Maybe guidelines for setting up safe home offices, protocols for reporting accidents, and even provisions for mental health support.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the elephant in the room, artificial intelligence. AI is automating tasks at an incredible rate, which is going to reshape job roles and introduce new risks.
Right, and we need to be thinking about how to ensure the safe design, implementation, and use of AI systems in the workplace. What about the potential for bias in algorithms, the risks of human-machine interaction, and the need for ongoing training as AI takes on more tasks?
All valid concerns. The Act will need to evolve to address these challenges, perhaps by establishing guidelines for AI safety, promoting transparency in algorithms, and ensuring that workers are equipped with the skills they need to navigate this new landscape.
It feels like we're on the cusp of a major transformation, and the Act needs to be nimble enough to keep up.
It does, but remember, at its core, the Act is about protecting people, and that principle remains timeless.
So even as the tools, the technologies, and the ways we work continue to evolve, that fundamental goal of ensuring health and safety has to remain at the forefront.
Exactly. And that brings us back to you, our listener. You're part of this evolving world of work.
And your perspective matters. We've explored the Act's past, present, and potential future.
Now we want to hear your thoughts. How do you think this Act should evolve to meet the challenges ahead? What new responsibilities should be considered? What protections are most crucial in this rapidly changing landscape?
This deep dive has equipped you with insights. Now it's your turn to share your perspective. Head over to our website or social media channels and let us know your thoughts.
We're eager to hear from you as we navigate this uncharted territory together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged. But most importantly, stay safe.